Welcome back to Heart of Texas Histories and Mysteries. I'm your host, Em, coming to you as always from deep in the heart of Texas. In this episode, I'll be telling you the story of an infamous tavern owner from the San Antonio area. He's been called the Butcher of Elmendorf, the Bluebeard of South Texas, and the Alligator Man. His real name was Joe Ball. No one knows for certain how many victims he actually had, but to this day he is associated with the disappearances and deaths of numerous women. What he is said to have done with these women's remains only makes his alleged crimes even more disturbing. You've probably heard of Tobe Hooper's 1974 film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You may also be familiar with his 1976 film, Eaten Alive. Well, it has often been said that the legend of Joe Ball was the inspiration behind that movie. Joseph Douglas Ball was born on January 7, 1896, the second of Frank and Elizabeth Ball's 8 children. Frank Ball had settled in Elmendorf, about 15 miles southeast of San Antonio, in the mid-1880s. He started a cotton processing plant there, which became extremely successful after the railroad arrived in the area. He also invested in real estate and owned a general store. The Ball family lived in one of the first stone houses in the community, a testament to the wealth they had acquired. It seems that Joe Ball had a normal, uneventful childhood. He preferred to keep to himself and enjoyed fishing and exploring the countryside. As he grew older, shooting became another favorite pastime. In a 2002 interview with Texas Monthly Magazine, his nephew, Bucky Ball, said, "My uncle could shoot a bird off a telephone line with a pistol from the bumper of his Model A Ford." Joe would put his skills to use during World War I when he enlisted in the Army. He received an honorable discharge and returned home in 1919. After briefly working for his father, Joe decided to enter a new line of business. The Prohibition era had just begun, and he saw opportunity in the constitutional ban on the production, transportation, importation, and sale of alcohol. As his siblings settled into quieter, more traditional professions, such as owning grocery stores and working for the local school district, Joe became a bootlegger. Obviously, this was dangerous business, but Joe loved the thrill of it. He drove all over in his Model A Ford, selling whiskey out of a 50-gallon barrel. He hired a man named Clifton Wheeler to assist him. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Joe had to come up with something else to do. So he opened a tavern, which he named the Sociable Inn, near what is now Highway 181. In the front of the building, there was a bar with a piano, as well as a room where patrons could not only sit and have a drink, but occasionally watch a cockfight. In the back of the building were 2 bedrooms. But what set Joe Ball's establishment apart from any of his competitors was what he had built outside. A pool that was surrounded by a 10-foot fence and contained 5 live alligators. Joe supposedly captured the reptiles himself in a low-water area in the nearby community of Graytown. He kept 4 small alligators and 1 large alligator on his property, and he used them to attract more customers to his tavern. On Saturdays, he would put on shows, during which the public could come and watch him feed the alligators. Sometimes he would give the alligators live raccoons or possums. Other times, he would toss live cats and dogs into the enclosure. Joe Ball hired many young, beautiful women to work at the Sociable Inn. Patrons noticed that these bartenders and waitresses never seemed to stay at the establishment for very long. When they brought this up to Joe, he would say that these employees were the type who moved around a lot and had only committed to work for him for short periods of time. This explanation worked, until it didn't. One female employee who did stick around for quite some time was Minnie Gotthard, also known as Big Minnie. Minnie appeared on the scene around 1934. Joe's friends were apparently not fond of her, describing her personality as loathsome. But Joe still decided to let her help him run his tavern. It appears that their relationship was not just a professional one, but a personal one. In 1936 to 1937, Joe became infatuated with two new waitresses, Dolores Goodwin, nicknamed Buddy, and Hazel Brown, nicknamed Shotzi. He now found himself juggling relationships with 3 of his employees, but this problem was short-lived. You see, in the summer of 1937, Minnie Gotthard went missing. Joe claimed that she'd had to leave town because she'd secretly had a child out of wedlock, not his child, according to him. He married Dolores Goodwin a few months after Minnie's disappearance. Even though rumor had it that he had once thrown a bottle at Dolores, leaving her with a scar that extended from her eye to her neck, she was said to be very much in love with him. Joe apparently told Dolores that Minnie had not run away, but that he had shot her in the head at a beach and buried her in the sand. But it seems that Dolores didn't press the matter any further. She certainly didn't go to the police with the information that Joe had shared with her. In early 1938, Dolores was injured in a car accident and had to have her left arm amputated. Rumors began to swirl that one of Joe's alligators had ripped her arm off. Dolores herself soon went missing, and so did her fellow employee at the sociable inn, Hazel Brown. Hazel had opened a bank account just a couple of days before she disappeared, but she never withdrew any cash from it. Joe Ball continued to run his business and was still doing quite well for himself, but Minnie Gotthard's family had never truly accepted his explanation for her disappearance, and later on in 1938, they turned to the Bexar County Sheriff's Office for help. Law enforcement did open an investigation and question Joe several times, but they could not find any evidence of foul play and decided that he was not a suspect. But then a young lady named Julia Turner, who had worked part-time for Joe, went missing too. It seems that her family turned to the police quite quickly. When some deputies paid him a visit, Joe said that Julia had told him she wanted to move on from her employment at the tavern due to personal issues. This seemed to satisfy law enforcement initially, but they searched the home where Julia had been living and found that she had left all of her belongings there. This led them to question Joe again, and he suddenly recalled that Julia had been having trouble with her roommate and that he had given her $500 to help her get out of her living situation. 2 more of Joe's female employees supposedly went missing after Julia did. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out their names. Law enforcement questioned Joe Ball again and again, but every time they spoke to him, he swore that all of the missing women had simply moved on to live and work elsewhere and that he didn't know their whereabouts. And due to a lack of evidence, the authorities couldn't charge him with any of the disappearances. But in September 1938, a former neighbor of Joe Ball's told authorities that he had witnessed Joe cut off parts of a human body and feed them to the alligators. Shortly after this, another man contacted the sheriff's department to report that there was an abandoned barrel behind Joe's sister's barn, and that a strange, foul smell was emanating from this barrel. The barrel was gone by the time Bexar County deputies John Gray and John Clevenhagen arrived to investigate. But Joe's sister apparently confirmed that the barrel had been there, and it seems that she had been suspicious of it too. Deputies Gray and Clevenhagen decided that another visit to Joe Ball's sociable inn was in order. When they told Joe that they were going to take him to San Antonio for some further questioning, he asked them if he could close up his establishment first. The deputies gave him permission and took a seat at the bar. Joe walked over to the cash register and hit the no sale button. When the drawer opened, he pulled out a .45 caliber pistol. Deputies Gray and Clevenhagen shouted, "Don't!" But Joe Ball ignored their pleas and shot himself dead. Accounts differ as to whether he shot himself in the head or in the heart. After Joe's death, officers from numerous agencies searched every inch of the property. They found large amounts of rotting meat in the alligator enclosure, as well as an axe that was covered in blood and hair. It certainly looked like there could be something to the rumors that had been floating around, and that Joe Ball had been killing women and feeding their remains to his alligators. Authorities also came to believe that Joe Ball had been involved in the disappearance of a teenage boy who had frequented the sociable inn. Now that Joe Ball was gone, law enforcement turned to Clifton Wheeler, Joe's assistant from the bootlegging days, who had still been working for Joe as a handyman. At first, Clifton denied knowing anything about the disappearances from the sociable inn. Soon afterward, however, he began to talk. Clifton stated that Joe had killed Hazel Brown after learning that she had a new boyfriend and planned to move away with this man. Joe had then put her body in a barrel, which he temporarily left behind his sister's barn and later made Clifton accompany him to pick up. Joe and Clifton then drove to a spot near the San Antonio River, where Clifton said that Joe held him at gunpoint and forced him to dig a grave. Clifton said that he initially resisted helping Joe dismember the body, but ended up holding Hazel's limbs down as the heavily intoxicated Joe struggled to saw them off. When the smell made them too ill to continue, they took breaks and chugged more beer. They buried the rest of Hazel's body, but burned her head on a campfire. Clifton took law enforcement to the place where all of this had occurred. Hazel's limbs and torso had been buried as he'd said, and there were pieces of a skull, a jawbone, and a few teeth where the authorities could tell that a campfire had once burned. Then came the answer as to what had happened to Minnie Gotthard. Clifton Wheeler stated that Joe Ball had taken her to Ingleside, a coastal community located across the bay from Corpus Christi, and shot her in the temple. Clifton apparently had a part in burying her in the sand. He said that Minnie had been expecting a child and that Joe had killed her because he didn't want Dolores to find out about it. Minnie's body was found where Clifton said it would be. Although law enforcement pressed Clifton for information about the other missing women who had worked for Joe, he swore that he had told them everything he knew. Clifton would serve 2 years in prison after pleading guilty to helping Joe Ball dispose of the bodies of Minnie Gotthard and Hazel Brown. He opened a bar after his release, but the wrath of the public was so intense that he left town. It's unknown where he went or what happened to him after that. Investigators found a scrapbook at the sociable inn that contained pictures of dozens of women, leading some law enforcement officials to speculate that Joe Ball had many more victims. But no one was ever able to establish a connection between Joe and any of the women in these photos, and Joe was never found to be connected to any other murders. His wife Dolores was eventually located in San Diego, California. She was alive and well. Another female employee who had disappeared from Joe Ball's sociable inn was discovered to be living in Phoenix, Arizona. In an interview she gave during the 1950s, Dolores stated that Joe never put no people in that alligator tank. She went on, "Joe wouldn't do a thing like that. He wasn't no horrible monster. Joe was a sweet, kind, good man, and he never hurt nobody unless he was driven to it. There were just 2 murders. Just 2 murders." Yes, she really said that. It is true that none of the rotting meat found in and around Joe's alligator pool was determined to be human flesh. However, some people still believed that Joe could have fed human flesh to his alligators and done a very good job of cleaning up any remaining traces of human bodies on the property. So there you have it, the story of the Butcher of Elmendorf, the Bluebeard of South Texas, the Alligator Man, Joe Ball. And in case you're wondering what happened to the alligators he kept at the sociable inn, they lived out the rest of their lives at the San Antonio Zoo. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, y'all.